Hello, and welcome to the Parent Problems Today podcast. I'm your host, Robert Trout, coming to you from the Parent Trainers community, where we do parent coaching and educational lessons and support for families all over the world. Today's episode's a little different. We have a special guest who's coming to speak with us. I know him professionally, and let me kind of introduce you to where he comes from, and then we'll get into what the episode will actually be about. Todd Weatherly lives just outside of Asheville, North Carolina with his wife and family. He has a bachelor's degree in psychology and a master's in outdoor education administration. He is a qualified mental health and substance abuse prevention professional, and he is the president of Stucker, Smith, and Weatherly, a therapeutic and educational consulting practice that guides families through their treatment journeys once a family figures out that they're going to need a higher level of care. He also produces the podcast called Mental Health Matters that I've been a guest on myself, and is here today with all of that background, but he is here to share as a father. So stepping right into our wheelhouse of families, parents to parents, giving support. And he's going to share a story that really steps into an arena to help families that are looking at the situation that is sometimes very shocking, where the path opens up and a child comes to you and says, I'm transgender. And then suddenly it's, okay, now what? And Todd, as a father, you've shared that you've had this journey. And I want to make sure for all the listeners that the same guidelines for every episode we record come into play here, where you're going to share your story. And this is not a fix-all. This is what you did and your experience. So if you're a parent listening to this, keep in mind our philosophy that there's not one answer. Today's kind of episode is going to step into the arena of what you did, Todd, and what you experienced and kind of what's unfolded for you and your family. But for all the other families listening, please take this as a moment to reflect on where you're at and how you're reacting and what's coming up for you. And keep in mind, you might need to tweak what you're doing to fit your family and your personality, etc. And when it comes to personalities, Todd has one of the most unique and amazing personalities I know. So welcome, Todd Weatherly, to the podcast. And I'd like to kick it off by just saying, where did this story start for you? When you think about this as a father and kind of how this has impacted you, where does this story really start?
Well, thanks, Robert, for having me on the show, first of all. The story starts, and I don't know how common the story is. I think that it's probably somewhat common that, with all the background you mentioned, with all the work I've done with behavioral health and mental health and across the board with adolescents and adults and everything else. My wife has a very similar background. We're very loving parents, very, I would say that we're pretty accepting of people, even when they're in disadvantaged positions or compromised positions, or among the disenfranchised, or among the people that are regarded in various kinds of ways and struggle with identity in life and everything else. We welcome a person at face value, and even so, our child did not come to us directly.
Interesting. Okay.
And so was working at a place. My brother has coffee shops in the area, and was working for one of them as a, kind of a first job, part-time deal, doing dishes, that kind of thing. And we got a text message from my brother who said, did your child change their name? And I was like, do I know? And my wife was the same way. I was like, what do you mean? Well, they just walked in and introduced themselves as such and such, and which was not their name. Or not the name not the name that we gave them, at least at birth. And so we're like, what's this all about? And we had a conversation with our child, and then I guess was 16,
Okay.
close to 17, working on driving, but not fully driving yet, that around that age. And, had been wearing a binder, and we're like, wore a lot of sweatshirts, wearing a binder, and began to change the tone of his voice, to drop it an octave.
Yep. Okay.
And so all these things, kind of crept up, and the name change was kind of the like, hey, what's up? And so one of the first things we did was engage a therapist, a therapist that could work with, my child and us as his parents around being able to like feel like he had a safe place to communicate about these things. Because if he was, for whatever reason, he felt uncomfortable talking about some of it. And it's like, okay, well, let's give you a neutral third to land that stuff with, and then pull us in when you've discovered a message you feel like you can share. It wasn't like we were having conversations about it and that sort of thing, but we wanted him to feel safe in sharing what he had to share. And part of what came out was he didn't want to burden us with it,
Mm.
which was like, you what? I mean, which is, actually very sweet, but also like, and, some point in time, going to come out, what I mean? And we're going to do something about it. But he was young, and that was fine. So we eventually went to, a joint therapy session with my wife, myself, and him, where he's like, this is how I feel, and this is where I want to go with that. And, this is my new name, and this is, this stuff. And, the big piece for me was identifying, again, very accepting of people, but that lives outside of my family, of the people that are part of my core unit. So what I discovered that I ran across some hurdles that existed in my thought process and in my ideology and value system and everything else about this topic and this specific experience being here for me as a family member, not as a outside person, you know? And I was like, and the other thing I said was, for the love of God, I've seen every kind of complex emotional behavior, maladaptive behavior, help people get into treatment. You had to pick the one topic I'm a complete novice about.
That's what kids are for.
Oh, that's what they're for. It's like you had to do the thing that I don't know. I don't know diddly about. And
Yeah.
so at any rate, I went through a lot of redefine.
Mm.
Like, well, I could hear my father, who's been, who's passed on from us for many years now. Passed away when my child was like 10 months old, like 11 or 11 months old.
Mm-hmm.
Just barely knew him. And I love my father, and he was a kind and gentle person, philosophical at heart. I don't think he would have taken it well. I don't think he would have handled it in a way that I would have wanted him to handle it.
Mm-hmm.
And there might have been some grappling there, because it wasn't something. I mean, even now it's not something I understand, because it's not my experience,
Mm-hmm.
but it's something I've cultivated a tremendous passion for. And I could hear my father, and I even at one point in time, very early on, told my oldest child, I said, look, that's great. You identify in whatever way you want to identify. You call yourself what you want to call yourself, or support you um, in that way. I I don't. We came to the conclusion that we don't think that we didn't think it was prudent to undergo any kind of therapy or other kinds of changes. It's like, look, I wouldn't let you go out and get a tattoo, you know, which is a
Mm-hmm.
permanent alteration to your body at this age. I'd ask you to wait, and when you're technically an adult, and even that is a stretch, but when you're technically an adult at the age of 18, you can make those kinds of decisions for yourself, and we'll support you in making those decisions. For now, we'll stay on this path, and call you by the name that you want to be called by, and identify you how you're going to be identified. But let's not do dramatic changes. I want you to be sure. I want you to be sure. And I know, from having done a lot of research about it, and going to the gyms, conferences, and things like that, that there are cases that are different. I'm on one hand not a huge fan of the super affirming strategy, and I'm not, and it is absolutely not appropriate to deny a person, what they're bringing up, for like, You don't want to over affirm. You don't want to under affirm. It's like, well,
For our listeners, do you mind kind of defining those two
sure.
sides? Because I know
Well,
some people are very new to this,
yeah,
especially if they just got that call from their brother saying, "What's going on?" So,
yeah,
can you define those for us?
I absolutely can. And, I think it's different depending on the age of your child.
Mm-hmm.
We've got a close family friend whose child decided that they were transgendered now and wanted to go by a different name and everything else. But he is 18. So, it's a little different, I think, when you're addressing someone who is an emerging adult or a young adult versus you're addressing someone who's a teenager and still under your care and still under your guardianship and everything else. And, there's lots of gray territory here, man. I tell you, I think you gotta
There
go
is.
with your own parental gut and heart and everything else. I'd say, first and foremost, love your child. Pretty simple. That's your guide. It's hard, if that's your guide, all parents screw up sometimes. But I think that loving your child, being your guide, is going to get you the best results. So, with regard to, there are individuals who hear a child that will come home, and there are even therapeutic professionals out there that will listen to a client, and they're saying, well, I feel like, I know I was born a girl, but I feel like a boy, or vice versa, or I want to go by they, or I want to change my name, or any of these other things. And and then I've heard of, I don't have a direct experience with an individual who's done these things, but I've heard plenty of stories about, let's go ahead and change your wardrobe, and let's go ahead and get you on, hormone changes, and let's go ahead and, we want to embrace this 100%. It's like, that's an overreaction. I also think that any such change, I mean, I don't buy a car, honestly, without doing a lot of research and looking at all the data and look at the thing, and what are the years that were good? Should I buy it at this year or that year? What's a cost? Are used models worth? There's like, I do a ton. It's a major purchase, and I want it to fit my needs, and I want it to do what I want it to do, and I'm picky about it. And I wouldn't make any major decision without giving it that kind of due, ultimately.
Mhm.
And I think this is a major decision. And I think that part of the issue that you run into is that adolescents and young adults are not used to doing the due diligence that goes into making major decisions and making them slow down. It's like, I'm not saying, I'm not trying to disagree with you here.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm trying to do is make you take, if you're talking about making permanent changes to yourself and your body, it is not something you want to do lightly. So let's take the time. I want you to live inside this skin for a minute and make sure it feels right, and do these things. But early on, I did say this very thing to my child. I said, look, I get you, and I hear you, and I support you. And if you were a bug and I were a biologist, I'd come and pick you up, turn you over, mark the gender that I saw, set you down on the ground, and walk away. And that's just that. There's truth that's there. So you have to reconcile that with the life that you want to go and lead, and how you want to present yourself, and what you want to be called, and everything else. I am very, very lucky in that my child has always been a person that knew exactly who they were.
Mm-hmm.
They have never had really much question about it, ever, even before any of this. And they also don't need you to believe them. They're not, they, you could misgender him and he wouldn't say anything. You probably won't, because he's done a lot of work to make sure that you don't. But if you did, or tried to be inflammatory about anything, he's just going to walk away. He doesn't need you to believe him. He doesn't need you to agree. He's not there to make a point. He's not interested in unless you're one of his friends or family or somebody that's part of his circle. He's really not interested. Your opinion doesn't matter.
Yeah.
He's gonna say whatever he needs to say, and he's gonna move on.
So for the listener, let's get a little clarity to this. How far into this process are you? Like, how many years in are you to this process?
So talking around six, so we're 5 years,
5 years.
and 5 years and top surgery.
Okay. 5
and
years. They have
testosterone
had
and hormones,
surgery. That
and
would
they're
be,
on
so they're
testosterone.
21.
21.
Okay. Okay. So we're into the 20s and they've started this process and it's their choice and you're being supportive, I assume, in your languaging and watching as it's going. Part of what we always step into for our organization that I want to ask you about is the consequences conversation, which you're kind of dancing around in a lot of what you said, because we talk about consequences not as good or bad, but as both. Like when you make a decision, that decision will change your life. That change is the consequence. Good or bad is irrelevant to the external. It's to the person holding the space for, how they're feeling in their new life. So as you've gone through this, you've kind of danced through some language around like, okay, you had these conversations with your child around like, well, let's slow it down and let's really hold space for the decisions you're going to make and we'll support it. But it's your decision. You made the decision. So the consequence then is owned, I'm assuming. So I want to open that and hand it to you and say, what does that look like as you're having those conversations in what I would assume is a very open way, because you said you and your wife are very like, okay, accepting, and this is just where it is. But when we look in through the lens of consequence conversation, what did that look like for you?
Oh, my wife was sad about being the only female in the family.
Ah,
All of a sudden, I'm
mm-hmm.
only, you know, I'm the only woman here. I thought I was going to have a daughter, and I think that strikes it. There's a nerve that's there. I think that it's an interesting concept to mourn a change in your child.
Mm,
You certainly, I mean, there's certainly a mourning process when they leave the house for the first, when they've left for the first year of college and they're no longer living in your house anymore. Like, you mourn the crap out of that. You know what I mean?
yep.
You're happy about it. I mean, it's something that you embrace and you want. I mean, you
Not
want
everybody is,
them.
Todd.
I, I am, I'm super happy about my child, like going into the world and getting
Yeah.
a college degree and enjoying their time at college. I love that for them, you know,
Mhm.
and I'm super proud of. And like, I'd love to have them back home. I mean, it'd be great,
Mhm.
you know. I'd love to have I like both of my children. Like they're great people, and I love hanging out with them. And when they go like that, you're like, it's bittersweet, as they say, you know. I know that it's not like that for every family, but it's like that for us. And for this, it was a very similar kind of reconciling some ideas, reconciling the kind of hard science head approach that I had about it or felt about it. It's like, I don't understand this. This is what I would do if I was a scientist and you were a bug. It was not a very compassionate message, but I was also saying the things that I felt. And then you start running into well, like I say, I'd hear the dad's voice. It's like, well, a man is a man and a woman is a woman. Like there's not, where's the in between here? Blah, 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 blah. I could hear all that stuff, even though I didn't believe any of it, even though it was not my own value system. But I didn't realize that voice was there until it started speaking.
Right. So you had to do your own personal work to deconstruct the beliefs that were handed to you.
100%. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's an important point when we get into this with families we're supporting, is the like, you're showing up not just with who you think you are, but back here is everything that was ever told to you from the generations before, grandparents, parents, etc. And there is, purposeful value in going in and finding those things and looking at them and saying, is this true for me?
Right.
Right? That personal work is such an important step.
Well, and it's very sneaky
Yes.
because it's subtle. It's subtle. But subtle things turn into opinions and conflicts and everything else. If you're not good at listening to the subtleties in your own voice, the voice that's you use to speak to yourself, this internal dialogue, and that you have. I know that not everybody has one of those, but I certainly do, and I think everybody can relate to the fact that, like, you know, uh, they had a parent or grandparent that they really, that they loved a lot, and that person's voice, they can hear that person's voice sometimes when they're in the middle of a tough time or when a certain situation is happening. You've got you speak to yourself. There are thoughts that go on in your mind. You don't say all of them, and there's a part of you that picks which thoughts that come to the mouth and then get said. And in those places, there are these gaps, and there are these nuances, and there are these subtleties of voice, and there are these subtleties of opinion and value system and everything else that if you're used to just letting it ride, and it comes out of your brain and out of your mouth, and you don't give it a lot of reflection, you're not going to be very good at catching those subtleties. And then if you are a person who chooses to do that work, you realize how uncomfortable and difficult it can be in the beginning of trying it. I started doing that sort of thing through my own process many years ago. And once you start doing it, it just doesn't go away. You never stop doing it. It's just a mechanism of your brain. It's like, do I really feel that way? Is that how I feel about this? Do I really feel like there's just these two categories? No, I actually don't. And I think the place where it came out that I noticed the most was when you refer to, if you've got a trans child, say they went from female to male, and you refer to them before they transitioned. So when he was a she and she was a child, and there's the stuff that comes out of your mouth. And that means that my child's gender is private information. It's none of your business. You can guess. I'm sure he'll correct you if you get it wrong, as I will. If you misgender me, I'll correct you. I'm not going to take offense unless you're trying to be offensive for some reason. Whatever. That's fine. And there's this lack of acceptance. I'm still clinging to this person when they were this other gender, that I knew them as a female. I knew them as a little girl. And now I was like, when he was a child, doesn't matter what his gender was when he was a child. It's when he was a child. When he was a child, he was in Girl Scouts.
Yep.
You know what I mean? There's aspects of the story that I leave out for individuals that it's none of their business. And then there are other peoples who are closer to us. It's like, this is the process we went through, and this is Felix now, and so on, blah, blah. There's all these pieces. But that was the one that got me, because I think I see a lot of people struggle with it. It's like, oh, when they were this, and they do use that language. And that, that kind of takes us to the under affirming side. You don't want to over affirm. You also don't want to, you've probably seen this before. I know I have, but parents who won't accept it at all and resist it tooth and nail, and there's no place in their schema that it can live, and they are doggedly rigid about the principles or values that are holding that approach or that perspective in place. And you get a child who feels unloved by their family. You've got children who start having suicidal ideation and thoughts, and experience anxiety and depression, and do poor academically. And you've got kids that are getting kicked out of houses. And then you've got families, and I know that this is, some of the stories I've heard, one story in particular, but you've got families who belong to a social group who are rigid that way, the church or whatever, and that's where their community is. And they choose instead to love and embrace their child, regardless of how, and not, accept them for who they say they are. And as a result, lose their community, because their community can't accept their decision to accept their child. Personally, I don't care. My child comes first, and I'm grateful not to have to suffer from that problem. But I know that other families have. And then some families make the choice to just be rigid, and they drive a wedge between themselves and the child, and then all of a sudden their child is in kind of pretty bad emotional territory.
Right.
And that
I'm going to use that as a springboard, because I want to make sure we touch on some of the topic pieces that we probably won't get into in your story. But for the listener, when we opened this episode and I talked about the shocking effect of someone coming out as transgender, in our experience, it's very often shocking, not because even of the revelation. Some families are like, yeah, we kind of suspected. There was something there. We knew something was there. We just didn't know which direction it was going to go. But even for them, the shocking element is very often this opening, this like confession and like, this is who I am, shapes the future of the whole family system. It just does. And the consequences of that, and again, consequence doesn't mean bad. It just means something has changed and now the consequences are going to unfold. And a big part of that is community and social interactions, family, where it's like, being disowned by certain grandparents or whatever it might be. There's all kinds of dynamics that unfold from this. So I just want to make sure we step into that for a moment, that everyone that's listening, very often the shocking effect is the fear that comes up for the parent, because usually they're the ones with the prefrontal cortex. So their brain skipping 5 steps ahead and seeing some of the results of the strife and conflict or even just the possibility of things becoming dangerous or violent for them in their community or whatever it might be, they see that. So we honor that the parent is the one that's going through the shock. And then step 2 is stepping into what, I'm glad you're talking about today, Todd, is hold on. How am I going to choose to hold this process as it unfolds? It really is a personal decision, knowing that those consequences might actually be real. The things you're afraid of, they might happen. You might get kicked out of your church. You might be disowned by someone. You might, have to stand up for your
Lose
child or change your
friends,
language
right?
or all these things. So all that is very real. And at the end of the day, when a child comes out as transgender, there's kind of 2 processes that we open up. One is doing the personal work to recognize the fear, recognize what is coming from the back of your mind, from, what you were raised with. All that kind of work needs to now be done. And then I'm going to pass it over to a second category. Then I'm going to hand back to you, Todd, in a second. Very often I call it the guide to 25, just because there's so many professionals that are happening now, professionals that are moving in the direction of guide to 25, being okay, you have decided that you would like to explore the possibility that you're transgender. You might have even decided, like, at a level like, this is what I am, etc. Now let's open up the therapeutic process. Let's open up the family conversation and the steps it would take, and do the research on the surgeries and the consequences, not just when things go right, but when they go wrong. So this isn't about fear. But Guide to 25 is the idea for every listener out there that by the time someone is 25, their prefrontal cortex is fully developed and they have a better understanding of that, like, background and research and understanding, and seeing a few steps ahead of where a decision will lead for them. And so I see a lot of people moving in that direction, including, and for me, this came from professionally working with individuals that were transgender and watching podcasts and episodes with individuals who decided they were heavily supported, as Todd mentioned earlier. So they started the process really early, and then they got into their mid-20s, and then they transitioned back to their original gender. So there's a lot of respect for me in the community, where it's just an open conversation. It's not I made a mistake or it was right or wrong. It was I began this journey, went that direction, only to find that wasn't actually what was going on for me. So I'm going to hand that back to you to just get your opinion on the Guide to 25 process that's kind of opening there, where it's like people going through this in stages and kind of giving a chance for everyone to hone that in. What comes up when I kind of bring that up to you, Todd?
Well, I did get pretty mechanistic about it, because on it, like I said, I wouldn't pick, I buy a car a certain way. For my kids, it's like making sure that they were individuals capable of navigating things that are going to come up in life, and they come up for you in life regardless. I mean, everybody's got, a coworker they don't like, or a boss that, yells at them, or a teacher they don't like, and a subject they're not good at. There are all these things, and it's like, yeah, but you probably still have to do the work, or yeah, you still have to go to work today and manage this relationship in some way that feels like you can continue to do it, or you've got a decision to make and you leave that environment for another one. What are the steps you've taken in order to do that? Like, there's just this, and the more the way that children make decisions, like, I am the,
Yes.
some shortened thought process has taken place, and they've announced to the world that whatever it is they've decided to do. And it's, my the best example is my other child who's, well, I'm gonna save up some money and get a sports car. I'm like, that sounds good. You gonna do that by yourself? Because right now this is the amount of money you make, and this is the kind of car that you can afford. You barely afford the car that you've got. And then when you graduate from school, you're going to get a job that will allow you to afford that car. How? And then, of course, you've got to remember that that car is a lot more expensive to maintain. Not only is it more expensive to purchase, it's more expensive to maintain. Maybe what you should consider doing is buying things that are reasonable. Set that as, I'm not telling you to give up the goal. I'm telling you to be thoughtful about it and be prepared for owning such a car. I also would love to have you with at least 5 years worth of driving experience before you drove something that was really, really fast. And and because you've totaled 2 cars already.
Yep.
And I'm thinking you're not going to want to total that one.
Yeah.
So you might want to be a more experienced driver. And I know that none of these thoughts occurred to you when you wanted to announce to me that you wanted to buy a sports car. And here we are. This is why I'm going to be the thoughtfulness for you in advance of you developing the skill. And,
Yep.
We approached this whole topic that same way with my son. We approach all topics, and then you reach the thing, and I think this is important, but you reach the thing that's hard to do.
Yeah.
Whether it's following through with an assignment, or, going and talking to a teacher who's giving you a bad grade, or heck, initially it was like, hey, Dad, go get me some chips. I'm like, here's the card.
Yeah.
Go get you some chips. Well, I don't want to go in and buy them. It's like, I don't either. And I don't want any chips.
Yep.
So here we are.
Yep.
And eventually
Yeah.
it's like, because he's uncomfortable, right? And it's like, yeah, you'll get over being uncomfortable. My favorite was, you're going to have to take this to the bank and cash this check because you're unable to do it virtually or whatever. And he's like, but I don't want to have to go to the bank and like go talk to people. And I was just like, that's so cute.
Yep. Well, therein lies the process, and we you talk about guide to 25 just in this transgender realm of like getting influence and therapy and family support and all these steps that can be taken step by step along the way. But there is that adult effect, right, where it's like you're going to start seeing like, oh, you want this. Well, if you do this, then you have to go to the bank. If you want the money, you have to go to the bank.
Right.
Like there's direct correlation to real adult mentality in life. And at least for us, we always talk with families, even if the kid's like 13, we're like, okay, how do you train this 13-year-old to be a functional young adult? And the parents' mind go, what? So
Right.
how do you teach them to think and recognize patterns and to hold space for consequences, both good and bad, and all the different things as you move them through each opportunity? So it really is a teaching opportunity, but in any subject. But for this subject, it's really that like, okay, I want you to understand that what you decide today impacts you tomorrow.
Well, and I had what you're talking about, the anger response, the shock response.
Mm-hmm.
And, it was like, look, man, I'm the protector for this family. I don't know if you knew this or not, but it's my role, and I protect the family. I protect this house. I protect the dogs and the cats, and I protect you as my children first and foremost, even above your mother. Like, we would both save you before we would save each other. And you could ask us and you get the same answer to that question. Like, that's how important you are. And now you're making a decision that I know it's like, it's a hard road to hoe, and there's all this stuff. And have you thought about all the things? And like, I had that reaction,
Yeah. That's a biological reaction.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That is a neurological pre-programmed. Yes. I understand.
I'm projecting the hardship already. You know what I mean? Like, so, and
Yep.
our children are not our projections, thank God.
Yeah.
And so they do things to surprise us. They're highly resilient in ways that we probably didn't know in the first place. And, they do something really special and cool with what they're given. I think, at least that's my experience. And I couldn't be happier about what's happening for him right now. And I think he's got a great thing going. I mean, And again, I'm lucky. My child worked, took a gap year, saved up enough money, paid for his top surgery.
Wow. That's
Every dollar
amazing.
of it. Yeah.
That's great. And I commend that. But there's that element, right? Like this is something that's important to you. So go and step in and make the decision and the investment
Mhm.
so that it's your decision and your outcome.
And if he had come to me and said, I'm a couple grand shy or something like that, we would have supported him. But the fact that he went forward and made that effort and took ownership, that
Yes.
was that was what I was looking for.
Yep. That's amazing. Really is. I commend that 100%. So, I mean, this conversation could go on and on and on, but I feel like that's an amazing spot to like, start wrapping this conversation up around like your adventure into the journey and kind of what's unfolded. I would ask if you don't mind closing this episode, just a quick, because you said like your son came out like, okay, this is what's going on. And you went, that's the one thing I know nothing about, which is
Right.
truly ironic. And I appreciate that on every single level as a parent. But okay, game on. I've
Dang
got
it.
to learn.
Really?
Would you mind telling our parents the top 2 resources that you stepped into that you would be like, start here? Read this book or go to that podcast or whatever. Like, what are the top 2, like for you, someone that's been through this 5 years down the road? Here are the 2 places I'd say, just start here to start reflecting and thinking. Where would you send people?
I think one thing that we did that I think everybody should do is go talk to another parent who's been through it.
Uh-huh.
And someone you think has kind of made some, seems to be going well, and they're kind of on the other side of this, and maybe they struggled, but seem to have a good thing going. If you pick a family that's in a lot of turmoil around it, and that's probably not your advice family, but to find a family that's been through it and has, struggled with it and done all the things that go along with it, but just come on the other side and listen to their story and listen to the resources they picked out. Because communities have resources sometimes that are not necessarily available broadly. And that's true for our area to a certain extent. But the other thing, being in behavioral health, I certainly reached out to individuals I knew who were consultants who had been working with families around the topic and, had them point me at resources, one of which, and the GEMS conference, always GEMS, the gender equality. So I miss up that it's a LBGTQ treatment and methodology and latest research kind of conference, bringing to the forefront what is here to be supportive to that community. And there's a lot there about transgender individuals and path that they've done, resources they access, etc. One of which is a university that has a center doing research on transgender. I can dig it out. I just don't remember it right now. But and what they have is, here's a lot of the biological research that we've done. Here's a lot of the stuff that says, it's really better to wait. Or there are some cases where you have human beings that are born hermaphroditic, that come out with both sets.
Mm-hmm.
And largely what happens, or what has happened to those people, is parents pick the gender, they cut the other off. I mean, that's essentially what happened. And so I think that, everybody's situation is different. Get as much both, here, that is another parent or another, their family that's gone through the experience, advice as you can. And then, get as much time tested, reliable, clinical information as you possibly can. If you go to one therapist, you might get one answer. If you go to another therapist, you might get this answer. But if you go to a center that's been doing research for a decade on this group of people, and these are the findings that they've had, these are the evidence-based kinds of either information, practices, or treatments that they have discovered, and their efficacy and those kinds of things, that's the kind of information you want to help guide you in making decisions you're going to find yourself having to make. And
Yeah.
so, I think I try to be careful about, there are scenarios out there that I don't know that involve biochemistry and other kinds of behaviors. And, you'll hear stories about a person who is now transgendered, that they knew that they were in the wrong body since they were like 2 years old. and they had been grabbing, and even though they were female, they had been grabbing bats and shorts and, identifying in that way as long as they could. And they knew it from the very beginning. It's like, what do you do with that person? Well, I would say that there's a lot of evidence to say that you need to let certain mile markers go by. And there are some markers that might indicate early intervention. They exist out there. They're rare, they're fairly rare. But if you feel like you're in that situation, go get the testing. Go get a doctor to advise you. Go get someone who's neutral and professional to give you good advice before you just start jumping onto decisions because of something a therapist said or a family member said or whatever. Like, get good information, make informed decisions. That would be my advice to
Yes.
anyone. And love your child first.
Thank you. That's a wonderful message. And so for any parent listening, this is one person's story, and it unfolds so individually for the person and the family. So hopefully this episode has helped and kind of brought some thoughts and reflection and ideas and hopefully some direction for what you might consider to do next. But for me, as a closing thought from what you just said, Todd, is slow it down. This doesn't need to be fast, impulsive process. This is all about safety and connection. And I love what you just said. Love your kid. That's the connection. Love your kid and step into them exploring who they are. You don't have to agree. You don't have to be like 100% on board or understand it immediately, all those things. This is going to be a process for you and them. This is individual as you both move forward in your lives together. So remember to love your child. Thank you, Todd, so much for joining us. And I'm sure he'll be on again in the future. And yeah, I really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Robert. Good to be here.